Your lecturer is Ann Curzan. Dr. Curzan is Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of English at the University of Michigan. She received her Ph.D. in English Language and Literature from the University of Michigan. Dr. Curzan has published on a wide range of topics including linguistics, pedagogy, and lexicography, and is a member of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. She has received numerous teaching awards and shares her insights on language on Michigan Radio's weekly segment, That's What They Say.
I grew up with a mother who cared deeply about language. I was taught to answer the phone, "This is she speaking." And if when I came home from school, I fretted, "The other kids are cooler than me," which was probably true, my mother would say, "Then I," which I have to say really did not help my coolness factor at all. One of our favorite stories about my mother and grammar happened at my older sister's wedding. My younger sister was giving a toast, and in the middle of the toast she said, "For my husband and I." And my mother, from the back of the room, pipes up, "My husband and me," in the middle of the toast. It is no wonder that I do what I do. I have been noticing the details of language ever since I was a kid. And when I found linguistics in college, I fell in love with this field. I'm fascinated by and study how the English language works and how it changes. And I'm always asking students to teach me new slang. I'm also a meticulous copy editor. I'm the kind of person who notices if a text says has proved in one place and then has proven in another place, or if the text isn't using commas consistently. In other words, I'm a complete geek about grammar. And I have a feeling that you're here taking this course because you also care a lot about language and how to use it well. You're in the right place. So, to get things started, because we're here to geek out about grammar, let's jump into a specific usage question and see whether we can all agree about what is acceptable usage. Then we can back up and think about who we rely on, or whom we rely on, to make these kinds of calls about acceptability. I'm going to give you a sentence, and I want you to decide if there are any problems with it. You need to rate this sentence, and you have 4 choices. Your choices are completely acceptable, somewhat unacceptable, completely unacceptable. Now, I do want to note that your decision here should not be about the meaning of the sentence. I don't actually care whether you agree with this sentence or not. The question is whether you think there's anything wrong or funny about the grammar. Are you ready? Here's the sentence. Experience is equally as valuable as theory. Let me give it to you again. Experience is equally as valuable as theory. How did you rate that? Was it in the acceptable category or unacceptable category? Are you bothered by the redundancy of equally as? Do you want it to be experience is as valuable as theory? Or did the sentence sound okay to you? Not something you would notice as having any particular grammatical issue. This sentence was on the usage ballot for the American Heritage Dictionary in fall of 2015. All the members of the usage panel were asked to vote on the sentence using exactly the same categories I just gave you, and with about as much instruction about what acceptability means. I'll tell you about how the usage panel voted in a minute, but first, let me give you a second related sentence that was on the ballot. Again, I want you to vote completely acceptable, somewhat unacceptable, or completely unacceptable. Here's the sentence. Aptitude is essential, but equally as important is the desire to learn. Let me give it to you again. Aptitude is essential, but equally as important is the desire to learn. Did you find equally as important unacceptable? Did you want it to be equally important? Or did equally as important sound idiomatic to you, like something you might say or write? Perhaps you're thinking right now, this is not yours to decide whether these two sentences are acceptable or not. What do the experts have to say? Well, in 1926, H.W. Fowler, the well-known grammarian, called equally as an illiterate tautology. In other words, an illiterate redundancy. Ouch! That feels like pretty strong condemnation for a sentence that perhaps some of you thought was perfectly fine. Let's look at the usage note on this construction in the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. The editors updated the usage note after the 2015 usage ballot, and here's what it now says. The adverb equally is often regarded as redundant when used in combination with as in, experience is equally as valuable as theory, or aptitude is essential, but equally as important is the desire to learn. In our 2015 ballot, the example sentences above were deemed unacceptable by 64% and 53% of the usage panel, respectively. Even among those panelists who rated the sentences as acceptable, there were several who commented that it would be preferable to avoid the redundancy for stylistic reasons. Fortunately, one can easily streamline sentences such as these as by deleting equally from the first example and as from the second. Interesting. Clearly, this bit of usage is contested when you're getting percentages like 64%, 53%. The panel is tipping toward unacceptable, but it's a close fight. Almost equally split on equally as important. Other folks are less happy with equally as. You'll also notice that some panelists are grappling with what is acceptable versus what they see as preferable for stylistic reasons. They're saying, okay, I'm willing to say it's acceptable, but I wish that you'd revise it to make it prettier. If you're thinking that this seems like a blurry line between what is acceptable and what experts prefer, you're right. And it's what we'll be talking about throughout this course. This seems like a good moment to say that I am on the American Heritage Dictionary usage panel. I'll fill you in on how I voted on those two sentences, but first let me tell you a bit more about the usage panel. The panel was created by American Heritage Dictionary in the late 1960s to give dictionary users guidance about formal writing by surveying a group of highly educated people invested in language. And that is the main criterion for being on the panel, is that you are professionally engaged with language. American Heritage, that dictionary, was a response to the hubbub over Webster's Third New International Dictionary, which was published in 1961. That dictionary, which tried to be very descriptive in its approach to language, was seen by some, particularly in the United States, as too permissive. It wasn't upholding the standards of the English language. The editors of Webster's Third did things like remove the usage labels like correct and incorrect, proper and improper, as well as erroneous. And some people did not like those usage labels being gone. Webster's Third also wrote about ain't in that entry, and here I'm going to quote, "Though disapproved by many and more common in less educated speech, used orally in most parts of the U.S. by many cultivated speakers, especially in the phrase, ain't I." Now, that entry on ain't caused an enormous amount of controversy, where people thought that there should be a stronger proscription of ain't than recognizing that cultivated speakers use it. As a result, suddenly Webster's dictionary seemed vulnerable. Webster's, up to that point, was seen as the dictionary, but now the market seemed open to competitors. And American Heritage jumped in and said, we will help and provide more advice and guidance on formal usage, as well as describing the language. So they put together this usage panel. This panel at this point is about 200 people. It's academics from a range of fields, people like Harold Bloom, Jill Lepore, Henry Louis Gates. There are journalists on it, people like Susan Stamberg. There are creative writers. Here are just a few: Maxine Hong Kingston, Sherman Alexie, Rita Dove, Annie Dillard, Junot Diaz. Radio personalities. David Sedaris is on the usage panel, as is Garrison Keillor. There's a world-class puzzle creator on the panel. That would be Will Shortz. And until 2016, there was a Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia. All in all on the panel, there are about a dozen linguists, one of whom is me. I've been on there since 2005. As you can see from that list of people, you've got a range of perspectives on this panel, a range of backgrounds, but I have to say, mostly older, mostly non-linguists. There was actually a funny article in the New York Times in 2006 where they were talking about the panel, and they were talking about whether the panel could actually be hip enough to keep up with the English language. And in the article, they noted that the youngest member of the panel was Anne Curzan, and the implication seemed to be that she really wasn't all that young. Now, you'll note that of the perspectives in the group, I bring an unusual one as a linguist. This perspective is less represented. And this is one of the things that makes this course you're taking unusual. You're getting an English professor who is deeply invested in the conventions of standard edited English, and a linguist who studies how the language works and how it changes. So you will get both the prescriptive guidance and the descriptive perspective on the language side by side throughout the course. Now, what happens when the usage panel is given these questions? Well, I have to say, the really unfortunate thing is that we are never all in one room at one time. I think that would be the most fun discussion if we could just debate grammar in a room, all 200 of us. We get this ballot over email, and we all vote in the privacy of our home or office on whatever grounds we want to vote on. Some people vote based on personal preference. Other people vote based on their favorite usage guide, which they might have in their office. Some look at data about actual usage. Now, sometimes when I get the ballot and I read through it, I know exactly what the question is after. It could be about they and whether we can use it as a singular, or about the difference between anxious and eager, or perhaps it's hopefully and whether we can use that to mean it is hoped. But sometimes I look at the sentence and I don't know what they're after. For example, I remember a set of questions about finalize, which it turns out was severely criticized in the 1960s as bureaucratic. It now strikes us as unexceptional. So, how did I vote this fall on these questions about equally as? I got the ballot and I tried, as I always do, to read the sentences in a very open-minded way, as if I was reading something that was already published and it was just on my desk. I read these sentences and I have to tell you, they struck me as unremarkable, not something that I would correct either as a professor or as an editor. And for those of you who felt that they were unacceptable, I hope that you have now not lost all respect for me and think I have no standards. So let me just remind you that almost half the usage panel was with me on this. But I don't just stick with my personal preferences or what I notice or don't notice. I want to figure out what's actually happening in the language, not just my own opinion. And I have to say, this is a really exciting moment to be able to study usage with online databases. In other words, we can now go online and use these databases for free to see what's actually happening with the language. For example, if you go to the Google Books Ngram viewer, you can search millions of books and see what's happening with a word or phrase. Then there are more linguistic-y databases online, including the Corpus of Contemporary American English and the Corpus of Historical American English, and I'll be relying on both in this course. For these questions, I went to look at the Corpus of Contemporary American English. This corpus is over 500 million running words, which is a huge corpus, and it has 5 different registers in it. Spoken, which is based on transcripts of unscripted radio and television programs. So you have spoken, magazines, fiction, newspapers, and academic prose. You can search words and phrases and see how they compare across those different genres or what's happening over time. That database covers 1990 to 2015. I went into this corpus and I searched for equally as, and I found it regularly in published prose. I found it in the Washington Post. I found it in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. In other words, places where there are clearly highly educated editors at work and they let equally as go through. Now, it is more common to get something like equally important than it is to get equally as important. But does that make it unacceptable to say equally as important? I have to say, I think no, and I voted that these sentences were acceptable. I too think it's probably preferable to edit out the repetition for stylistic reasons. But all in all, I think those sentences are perfectly acceptable in edited prose, and there are editors who are already letting it through. In other words, I'm trying to isolate the question of, does the repetition make the sentence wrong? And my answer would be, not inherently. There's nothing inherently wrong with repetition. And you can find other examples in the language where we have no problem with repetition. Think about the expression, each and every. Well, that's clearly repetitive, but we see it as usefully emphatic. Think about terms and conditions, also repetitive, but can do a kind of emphasis, and one could argue that equally as is also emphatic. I hope that you're thinking right now that this answer I've given you about the acceptability of equally as does not make right and wrong sound particularly clear-cut. It's not. There isn't some objective measure of whether a grammatical construction is acceptable. Judgments about acceptability also change over time, as we're going to see throughout this course. To me, this is one of the things that makes studying grammar endlessly interesting. And I honestly believe that if you can accept and even embrace the complexity and subtlety of what acceptable means when it comes to usage, it allows you to write and edit with even more nuance. It allows you to be careful, in the best sense of that word, to care about the language and how to use it best in any given situation. We can master the usage rules that help us write appropriate prose in formal contexts and even write beautiful prose. And we can recognize where the usage guides don't agree because the language is changing or because our sensibilities are changing. Then, there are bits of grammar people haven't noticed as much. For example, is it have showed or have shown? No one seems to care right now. Both are standard, acceptable in formal prose. That is not the case for everyone with have proved versus have proven. And if you're now thinking, wait a minute, I'm not sure that I make any distinction there, don't worry, we'll come back to that. In the next lecture, we'll think in much more detail about the grounds on which people have called some usage right and some usage wrong. Right now, I'm just asking you to keep an open mind to thinking about grammar in what may be a new way. When I say that we should keep an open mind, I'm not saying we should throw out all the usage rules we've learned. The conventions of formal, standard, edited English can be very valuable. First of all, there's just the value of standards in general. It helps that we have standard measurements so that we can all talk about inches and miles or kilometers. It helps that we have standard money. It also can help to have a standard language. It allows us to communicate across dialect differences. It's also true that some of the advice in usage guides that governs how we write in more formal contexts, and that we'll be covering in this course, can help you to write clearer, more aesthetically pleasing prose. Some of the rules about formal grammar can help you avoid ambiguity and capture tone and prosody on the page in effective ways. All of this is really important and worth knowing. But it's valuable to distinguish preferable from correct or the only acceptable thing. It's worth asking questions about a usage rule that's been handed down for generations to see if we really do want to follow that rule anymore. Asking those questions and making those distinctions makes us even savvier writers and speakers who are making deliberate, informed decisions about the language we want to use in context. And context is key. Being able to respond to context and adapt your language appropriately is what makes you a skilled writer. Now, linguists like me are sometimes accused of being hypocrites because we point out the very humanness of the rules that govern formal edited English, and sometimes their faulty logic, and then we often follow those rules when we ourselves write books and articles. Fair enough. But of course, this is because we recognize the value of the standard, like everyone else, and are aware of the expectations and judgments that may come if we don't follow them. I'm very familiar with this conundrum, as you already know. I'm trained as a linguist, and I study both how language changes and where usage rules come from, which means that you become very aware of the human foibles behind some of these rules. And I teach students all about that. At the same time, I am an English professor whose job it is to make sure students control the conventions of formal edited English, even the ones that aren't particularly well justified. And as I mentioned, I'm a copy editor who cares about every comma and who has pet peeves like everyone else. So how do I make sense of that? How do I wear these two hats often at the same time? The answer is that my inner Commando and I have a lot of long talks. Most of us, I think, have an inner Commando. This is a great word, which was introduced by Lizzie Skernick in the New York Times Magazine in 2012 in the feature called That Should Be a Word. And she defines Commando as one who constantly corrects others' linguistic mistakes. The example she gives is, cowed by his Commando wife, Arthur finally ceased saying irregardless. I have to say, I really prefer Commando to grammar Nazi, which is the other term we have for people who correct other people's grammar. If we're going to talk about Nazis, let's talk about Nazis. If we're talking about people who correct other people's grammar, let's talk about Commandos. And it also gives you the great expression, to go Commando on someone. We have the things, each of us, that we notice and don't like, our pet peeves. And often we have very strong feelings about these bits of usage. It could be impact as a verb, or between you and I, or drive slow, or different than, or perhaps based off rather than based on. And some of you are probably cringing right now. There are so many pet peeves to choose from. And we'll talk about all of those and more in this course. What's fascinating is how strongly we can feel about these. People use words like hate and drives me crazy. When we talk about grammar, it often comes to represent much more than grammar. It can be about whether education is working, about whether people care about the details anymore, about not just if language is in decline, but also perhaps if culture more generally is in decline. One of the useful things about being a historian of the language is that I can see the things people hated 100 years ago and 200 years ago, some of which are now standard. I'll share some of these quotes throughout the course to help us keep perspective on the usage issues that are driving us crazy today. So what don't I like? I don't like the word impactful. I think it's ugly. And I prefer a person who to a person that. My inner Commando and I talk about what I'm going to do with these likes and dislikes. I can choose not to use the word impactful in my own writing, which I do choose not to use it. But given how widespread the term now is in published writing, I don't have good grounds to correct it in other people's writing, and I don't. Now, I used to correct the person that and change it to the person who, but an astute graduate student pointed out that I had no good grounds for doing so. As he pointed out, if you look in standard usage guides, it says it is perfectly acceptable to use the person that, and I should have known better. As a historian of the language, I should have remembered that the person that has a long history in the language. So now I notice things like the person that, but I keep my pen quiet and I don't circle it. In other words, I recognize what is my thing and what is a point of usage that might get more widely criticized in formal writing. And if it's my thing, I keep my pen quiet. If there's a chance a student might get criticized for it, I alert them to it. You have probably noticed that I'm using the word usage a lot. An American Heritage Dictionary calls the panel the usage panel, not the grammar panel. I sometimes like to call this course Grammar Boot Camp, but I'll frequently use the word usage as well. The basic definition of usage is how words and phrases are used in speech and writing. It's understood broadly as encompassing pronunciation, word meaning, morphology, in other words, the structure and form of words, including inflectional endings, a question like, is funnest okay? Usage also encompasses syntax, how words combine into sentences, as well as punctuation. Grammar, that word, is typically used more narrowly in linguistics to cover morphology and syntax, so not pronunciation and punctuation. But certainly you will find popular grammar books out there that cover pronunciation and punctuation. Both grammar and usage can be and are used descriptively to refer to what speakers and writers actually do with the language, and more prescriptively to refer to what speakers and writers should do with the language to demonstrate good usage or good grammar. The next two lectures will unpack this more prescriptive approach and more descriptive approach to grammar and usage in more detail. For now, let me ask you to do a couple of things as part of being open-minded, depending on how you feel about grammar. If you are someone with an opinionated, fairly outspoken inner Commando, I'm asking you to get in touch with your inner Commando and offer up a dialogue where you two can revisit usage questions your inner Commando might think are already settled and hash out how you want to handle them. I'm asking you to push pause before labeling anything right or wrong too quickly, as we learn more about where these rules come from and how both the rules and the language may have changed. Why? What are the benefits of having that dialogue with your inner Commando? It will make you even more careful, with an increased sensitivity to the role of context and the effects of language change. It will also make you more confident that you aren't getting it wrong when you are helping other people with usage. More importantly, it allows us to understand language difference as difference, not deficit. Language is a key part of culture, and understanding the diversity in our language is an important part of understanding the diversity among speakers. We can help others master the conventions of standard formal usage without making others feel bad about themselves or about their language, which is a very worthy goal. And if you want that to be feel badly rather than feel bad, stay tuned until lecture 14. If you are someone who feels some insecurity about your mastery of grammar, I'm asking you to believe me that you know more than you think you do, or than you give yourself credit for. You know English grammar in this really intricate way that allows you to communicate with all the speakers around you. This is the descriptive sense of grammar. You may not have every piece of terminology or all the formal usage rules for written English, but you know a whole lot about how English grammar works. The fun thing about this course is that we will unpack, analyze, and put labels on all of this knowledge that you carry around with you. And we'll talk about the usage rules that may distinguish written English from spoken English, formal English from informal English. With all of this knowledge, we can be ever more skilled speakers and writers. And along the way, you'll learn a lot of great facts about the elaborate system and the kooky idiosyncrasies in English grammar. The structure of this course is going to work this way. As I mentioned, the next 2 lectures address prescriptive and descriptive approaches to grammar. Then, after a quick review of some fundamental terminology about words, phrases, and clauses, we're going to dive into the details of different parts of speech and all the related usage issues that come with them. I have loosely organized the course around major parts of speech, like nouns, verbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and the like. And as we talk about how that part of speech works, we'll address the tricky usage issues that come up with that part of speech. For example, can you leave a preposition dangling at the end of a sentence? I know you want to know the answer to that, but you're going to have to patiently wait until Lecture 18 for the answer. And if you're thinking, now Anne, that should be to wait patiently. Don't split that infinitive and put patiently between to and wait. If you're thinking that, then you're ready for the next lecture, because we're going to talk about where that rule about split infinitives comes from.